The air backstage was thick with the smell of hairspray and cheap coffee. It was a chaos of bright colors and nervous energy, a place where dreams were either born or went to die. Young people, all impossibly fit and polished, paced back and forth. Some were doing vocal exercises, their voices trilling up and down the scales in a flurry of notes. Others were stretching, their limbs bending in ways that seemed almost unnatural. A young woman with sparkly eyeshadow that caught the light like a disco ball was practicing a dance move, spinning so fast she became a glittery blur. In the middle of all this motion and noise, sitting on a simple metal chair that seemed to have been left there by mistake, was Eleanor. She was a small, quiet island in a raging sea of ambition. At 72, her world was usually one of soft-spoken words, the gentle rustle of book pages and the ticking of a grandfather clock. This place was the complete opposite. It was loud, it was fast, and it was terrifying. She clutched the worn leather strap of her handbag, her knuckles white, and watched the spectacle unfold around her. Her cardigan, a sensible beige one she had owned for years, felt drab and out of place amongst the sequins and leather jackets. She felt like a black and white photograph that had accidentally been dropped into a bucket of neon paint. A young man with a perfectly sculpted beard walked past her, giving her a quick, curious glance before turning back to his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen. He probably thought she was someone's grandmother who had gotten lost on her way to the restroom. He wasn't entirely wrong. She was a grandmother, but she wasn't lost. She was here on purpose, a fact that still surprised her every morning when she woke up. A young woman with a waterfall of blonde hair stopped in front of her, her brow furrowed with concern. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked, her voice dripping with a sweet, syrupy pity. "You look a little pale?" Eleanor offered a small, tight smile. "I'm all right, dear. Just a bit nervous." The woman nodded, as if this was the most natural thing in the world for someone like Eleanor to be nervous about. "Well, good luck," she said, though her tone suggested she thought luck was the only thing Eleanor had going for her. Then she was gone off to find her own corner to prepare. Eleanor looked down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. They were wrinkled and spotted with age, the hands of a woman who had spent a lifetime gardening, baking, and carefully handling fragile books. They were not the hands of a performer. She thought about her late husband, Arthur. He had always loved her voice, not just when she sang to him in their quiet living room, but when she was simply reading the newspaper or talking on the phone. "You have a music in you, Ellie," he used to say, his eyes twinkling. "It's not just in your throat, it's in your soul." After he passed away 2 years ago, the music had felt like it died with him. The house became too quiet, the days too long and gray. She had retired from the library, and her world had shrunk to the size of her small garden and the 4 walls of her living room. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, she had been flipping through television channels when she landed on a show called Starbound. She watched as a succession of young, talented people sang and danced their hearts out, hoping for a chance at a new life. And a crazy thought had popped into her head, a thought so wild and out of character that it made her laugh out loud. I could do that. The idea was absurd. She was old. She was not glamorous. She didn't have a sob story, just a quiet life that had lost its color. But the thought didn't go away. It lingered, a tiny spark in the darkness of her grief. It was a spark of defiance, a final, rebellious act from a woman who had spent her entire life being sensible and quiet. So she had found the application online, filled it out with her arthritic fingers, and sent it in, fully expecting a rejection email. But then the call had come. And now here she was, a relic from another time, about to step onto a stage that was built for the young and the bold. A voice crackled over a speaker, cutting through the noise. "Eleanor Vance, you're on in 5. Her heart gave a painful lurch. This was it. There was no turning back. She stood up, her knees feeling a little wobbly. A production assistant with a headset and a harried expression pointed her down a long, dark hallway. "Just follow that line on the floor, sweetie," she said, before turning away to shout into her microphone. The hallway felt like a mile long. The muffled roar of the crowd grew louder with each step she took, a hungry beast waiting just beyond the curtain. She could hear the host's voice, amplified and booming, hyping up the audience. She thought of the kids at the library, the ones who would come in after school, and their faces lit up with excitement about the latest pop star. What would they think if they could see her now? They would probably laugh. They would be kind about it, but they would still laugh. She reached the end of the hallway. A large man in a black shirt stood guard by a heavy velvet curtain. He gave her a nod. "Good luck," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first genuine piece of encouragement she had received all day. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and electricity. She could feel the heat from the stage lights bleeding through the curtain. She could hear the host saying her name. "And now, folks, we have a very special contestant for you. Please give a warm welcome to Eleanor." The curtain began to rise. Eleanor squared her shoulders, a gesture she had learned from Arthur, who always said it was the best way to face a challenge. She stepped forward, out of the darkness and into the blinding light. The wall of sound that hit her was immense. It was a mix of applause and something else, something softer and more condescending. It was the sound of an audience being polite, of people humoring the sweet old lady who had wandered onto the big stage. She blinked, her eyes struggling to adjust to the glare. The arena was a vast, dark space, filled with thousands of tiny, blinking lights from the audience's phones. It was like looking up at a night sky filled with stars. In the center of it all was a single spotlight, and she was standing in it. She felt exposed, like a bug under a microscope. She could see the judges' table in the distance, 3 shadowy figures. She couldn't see their faces, but she could feel their eyes on her, sizing her up, dismissing her in seconds. The host, a man with a smile so bright it seemed to be painted on, approached her. He put a gentle arm on her shoulder, as if she might break. "And what's your name, and what will you be performing for us today?" he asked, his voice smooth and practiced. Eleanor opened her mouth, but for a moment no sound came out. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. But then she thought of Arthur and the music in her soul he had always talked about. She found her voice, small but steady. "Eleanor Vance," she said. "I'm going to sing." The host gave the audience a knowing look, a little smirk playing on his lips. He had seen this all before. The sweet old lady, the off-key tune, the sentimental moment that everyone would forget by tomorrow. But as Eleanor stood there, alone in the circle of light, she knew that this was not going to be like all the other times. She was not here to be a sentimental moment. She was here to be heard. The walk from the edge of the stage to the single, lonely microphone stand in the center felt like the longest journey of Eleanor's life. The floor was slick and polished, and her sensible flat shoes made soft, sticky sounds as they lifted and fell. Each step was a conscious effort. Her heart was not just beating. It was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild bird trying to break free. The heat from the spotlights was immense, like standing too close to an open oven. It baked her face and made the thin fabric of her cardigan feel heavy and suffocating. She could feel a single drop of sweat trace a slow, ticklish path down her temple. The arena was a cavern of darkness, a vast, empty space dotted with the tiny, distant lights of the audience's phones. It was impossible to see individual faces, only a sea of anonymous blinking stars. But she could feel their eyes on her, thousands of them, all curious, all expecting something. What were they expecting? Probably a trembling, off-key version of an old folk song. A sweet, slightly sad moment that would make them say, "Aw," before they forgot about her completely. The host glided back to her side, his movements smooth and practiced. He had a smile that could have been carved from a block of wood. It was so perfect and unmoving. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but felt more like he was steadying a fragile vase that might topple over at any moment. "And what's your name, and what will you be performing for us today?" he asked, his voice booming through the massive speakers, echoing back at them from the far corners of the arena. Eleanor leaned into the microphone, its cold metal a small anchor in the storm of her fear. Her own voice, when it came out, sounded small and thin, like a thread of smoke in a hurricane. Eleanor Vance, she said. I'm going to sing. The host turned to the audience, his grin widening. He held up a hand as if to say, "Did you hear that? Isn't she adorable? Eleanor, everyone," he announced, and a ripple of polite, pitying applause washed over her. It was the kind of applause you give a child who has just fallen off a swing but isn't badly hurt. "Now, Eleanor," he continued, his tone dropping to that syrupy, condescending level she recognized from the kind woman backstage. "Tell us what brought you here today. Are you a big fan of the show?" Eleanor thought for a moment. How could she possibly explain the quiet grief, the lonely house, the memory of her husband's voice in her head? How could she explain the spark of defiance that had led her to this terrifying, wonderful place? She couldn't, so she just settled for a simple truth. "My husband always said I should," she said softly. "He thought I had a song in me." The audience let out a collective awe. It was exactly the reaction she had feared. She had been reduced to a sweet, grieving widow. A sentimental story. The host patted her shoulder again. "Well, he sounds like a very smart man," he said, his voice full of a warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "We are all very excited to hear that song." He wasn't, of course. Neither was anyone else. The camera, which had been focused on her, now swung over to the judge's table. It was a long, sleek desk bathed in its own special lighting, making the three figures sitting behind it look like royalty on a throne. Eleanor could now see them clearly. In the middle was the man everyone called Simon. He was leaning so far back in his chair that he looked like he might tip over. His chin was jutting out, and his arms were crossed tightly over his chest. He wasn't even looking at her anymore. He was staring up at the ceiling as if he was immensely bored and had only a few seconds left to live. As the host spoke, Simon let out a long, theatrical sigh that was picked up by his microphone. A few people in the audience chuckled. He then leaned over to the judge sitting next to him, a young woman with bright pink hair who was a famous pop star. He cupped his hand around his mouth, but he didn't cup it enough. "Another one," he muttered, his voice a dry rasp. "Just what we need. A grandmother who's going to sing Somewhere Over the Rainbow. I can feel my excitement levels already plummeting." The pink-haired judge gave a tight little smile. She was trying to be professional, but Eleanor could see the amusement in her eyes. She was young and successful, a product of this very modern world of pop music and instant fame. To her, Eleanor was just a fossil, a quaint reminder of a bygone era. The third judge, a quiet-looking man in round-rimmed glasses who was a famous music producer, simply stared at Eleanor with a blank expression. He wasn't being mean like Simon, but he wasn't being kind either. He was just observing. He was looking at her not as a person, but as a product. Was there any market for this? Could this be packaged and sold? The answer, written all over his face, was a clear no. They had judged her. It had taken them less than 10 seconds. The walk to the microphone, the sound of her voice, the sight of her cardigan, the mention of her late husband. It was all the evidence they needed. The verdict was in. She was a joke. A novelty act. Human filler. A wave of heat washed over Eleanor, and this time it wasn't from the lights. It was a flush of pure, undiluted anger. It was a hot, sharp feeling that cut through her fear. It wasn't a loud, shouting anger. It was a quiet, cold fury that settled deep in her bones. She thought of all the times in her life she had been dismissed. The men at the library who had asked her to fetch them coffee when she was the head librarian. The salespeople who would talk to her younger male colleagues instead of her. The way people's eyes would glaze over when she started talking about her passion for historical poetry. She had spent 72 years being quiet, being sensible, being invisible. Arthur had been the only one who had ever truly seen the fire inside her. And he was gone. The host finally retreated to the side of the stage, leaving her completely alone in the circle of light. The silence that fell over the arena was heavy. It was a waiting silence. The audience was ready to be entertained, or at least to be gently amused. The judges were ready to get it over with. Simon had even picked up a pen and was doodling on a piece of paper in front of him. Eleanor looked down at her hands, still clutching her worn handbag. For a fleeting moment, she thought about just walking away. She could thank them, turn around, and disappear back into the darkness of the wings. No one would be surprised. It was the sensible thing to do. But then she looked up, past the blinding lights, into the vast, dark emptiness of the arena. She wasn't here for them. She wasn't here for the judges or the audience or the host with the fake smile. She was here for Arthur. She was here for the quiet librarian who had always dreamed of making a noise that people would actually listen to. She took a slow, deep breath, filling her lungs with the hot, electric air. She let go of her handbag, letting it drop gently to the floor beside her feet. It was a small gesture, but it felt enormous. It was like she was dropping a shield she had been carrying her whole life. She straightened her back, pulling her shoulders back, just as Arthur had always told her to. She looked directly at Simon, who was still scribbling on his paper. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not to him, but to herself. It was time. The music was about to start. The silence that followed the host's retreat was a living thing. It was heavy and thick, pressing down on the arena, filled with the unspoken thoughts of thousands of people. They were all waiting for the sweet, sad little song, waiting for the awkward, off-key notes, waiting for the moment they could all feel a little bit of pity and then move on. Eleanor stood in the center of the spotlight, a small, still figure in a vast ocean of expectation. She had dropped her handbag, and it felt like she had dropped an entire lifetime of being quiet. Her heart was still beating fast, but it was a different kind of fast now. It wasn't the frantic, scared beat of a trapped bird. It was the powerful, steady rhythm of a drum, building to a crescendo. She thought of Arthur again, not with sadness this time, but with a fierce, burning pride. He was the only one who had ever heard this music in her, the music she had kept locked away for so long. "Let it out, Ellie," he used to say when they were alone in the car, and a hard rock song would come on the radio. "Sing it loud. Don't let the world tell you to be quiet." She never did. She was too worried about what the neighbors would think, too concerned with being the proper librarian, the sensible grandmother. But now, standing on this huge stage, she realized she didn't care anymore. Let them think what they wanted. She closed her eyes for just a second, and in that darkness, she saw his face smiling at her, encouraging her. When she opened them again, the world was different. The blinding lights didn't feel hot anymore. They felt like a source of power. The thousands of eyes didn't feel judgmental. They felt like witnesses. And then it began. A sound blasted from the massive speakers, a sound so unexpected and so violent that it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't a gentle piano or a soft acoustic guitar. It was a deep, distorted guitar riff, thick and heavy, like a runaway train crashing through a wall of bricks. It was followed by the thunderous, relentless pounding of a double bass drum, a rhythmic assault that shook the very floor of the arena. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, looking at each other with bewildered expressions. This wasn't right. This wasn't supposed to happen. On the judges' table, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Simon, who had been slumped in his chair in a state of advanced boredom, shot upright. The pen fell from his hand and clattered onto the desk. His look of annoyance was quickly replaced by one of complete and utter confusion. He stared at the stage as if trying to figure out if there was some kind of technical mistake. The pop star judge with the pink hair, who had been looking boredly at her nails, flinched as the wall of sound hit her. Her head snapped up, her perfectly composed expression shattering into one of sheer disbelief. The quiet producer judge pushed his glasses up his nose, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. He was leaning forward now, his body tense, like a predator that had just spotted something it didn't understand. The host, who was standing just off stage, looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. His practiced smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed gape. He was holding his earpiece, as if trying to get an explanation from the control room, but there was none to be had. This was not a mistake. This was the music. And then Eleanor opened her mouth. The sound that erupted from her was not the soft, reedy voice they had heard before. It was not the voice of a 72-year-old retired librarian. It was a guttural, powerful, and impossibly deep growl. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated energy, a vocal onslaught that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the air. It was a sound that came from a place deep inside her, a place of raw, untamed power that had been caged for a lifetime. For a full 5 seconds, the entire arena was frozen in a state of profound, collective shock. It was as if someone had pressed a giant pause button on the world. The nervous murmuring from the audience died instantly. The fidgeting stopped. Everyone was staring, their eyes wide, their mouths open, their brains struggling to process the impossible thing they were witnessing. The sound was coming from her. From the small woman in the beige cardigan. From the sweet old lady who had talked about her late husband. It didn't make any sense. It defied logic, it defied age, it defied every single assumption they had made about her in the few seconds she had been on stage. The camera zoomed in on Eleanor's face. Her eyes, which had been soft and gentle, were now blazing with an intensity that was almost frightening. They were the eyes of a warrior, a front woman, a queen commanding her army. Her face, which had been a mask of nervousness, was now a picture of fierce concentration and raw emotion. She wasn't just singing a song. She was exercising a lifetime of demons. She was channeling all the quiet frustrations, all the unspoken dreams, all the grief and the love and the anger into that one incredible sound. The camera cut back to the judges. Simon's cynical mask had completely shattered. His jaw was literally hanging open, his face a perfect portrait of astonishment. He wasn't leaning back anymore. He was leaning so far forward he was almost on top of his desk. He was staring at Eleanor as if he was seeing a unicorn, a mythical creature he had never believed could exist. The pop star judge was no longer looking at Eleanor with pity or amusement. She was looking at her with awe. As a musician herself, she could understand the technical skill, the raw power, and the sheer lung power it took to produce a sound like that. It wasn't just noise. It was art, it was raw, brutal, and beautiful. The producer-judge had a small, slow smile spreading across his face. It wasn't a cynical smile or a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had just struck gold. He wasn't seeing an old woman anymore. He was seeing a story. He was seeing a phenomenon. He was seeing the most shocking, the most compelling, the most unforgettable audition he had ever seen in his entire life. The 5 seconds of frozen silence ended, and the world came rushing back in. But it was a different world now. The air in the arena was electric, crackling with a new and powerful energy. The audience was no longer a passive, polite group of spectators. They were leaning forward, completely captivated, utterly enthralled by the seismic transformation unfolding before them. The phones that had been held up to record a funny clip were now held steady, capturing history. They had come to judge a book by its cover, but the book had just been thrown open, and the pages were filled with a story so wild and so unexpected that no one could have ever predicted it. Eleanor held the growl for what seemed like an eternity, a sustained, powerful note that vibrated through the entire building. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the growl softened, melting into a surprisingly melodic, clean-sung verse that was filled with a raw, haunting sorrow. The contrast was breathtaking. The beast had a beautiful soul, and the performance had truly just begun. The shock that had frozen the arena began to thaw, but it didn't melt back into the condescending pity from before. It transformed into something else entirely, something powerful and magnetic. It was awe. The initial 5 seconds of disbelief had given way to a captivated silence, the kind of deep, quiet focus you rarely see in a crowd of thousands. The timid librarian who had walked onto the stage just minutes ago had vanished. In her place stood a commanding front woman, a figure of raw, untamed energy. Her eyes, which had been soft and nervous, were now blazing with an intensity that held the thousands of spectators captive. She wasn't just looking at them. She was looking through them into a past only she could see. The song was an original composition, a thunderous epic that seemed to tell the story of a lifetime. The heavy, distorted guitars and the relentless pounding of the drums created a massive, dark soundscape, a storm of sound that she navigated with complete control. Her voice was the lightning within that storm. She didn't just growl. She wielded the guttural roar like a weapon, a sound of pure defiance against every expectation, every stereotype, every moment in her life she had been told to be quiet. Then, in a breathtaking turn, the brutal assault of sound would soften, and she would sing a clean, hauntingly melodic chorus. It was a voice filled with a raw, piercing sorrow, a sound that spoke of lost time and silenced voices. The contrast was staggering. It was like listening to a beast and a bird singing the same song, a duet of rage and regret. The camera, which had been sweeping across the stunned audience, locked back onto the judge's panel. Simon, the notoriously harsh critic, was a picture of pure astonishment. His cynical mask had been not just cracked, but completely shattered. His jaw was literally agape, his mouth hanging open in a way that would have been comical if the situation weren't so profound. He wasn't leaning back in his chair anymore. He was perched on the very edge, his body tense, his eyes wide. He was staring at Eleanor as if he was witnessing an impossible event, a miracle happening in real time. All his years of experience, all his quick, cruel judgments, had been rendered useless in the face of this performance. He had been so sure, so arrogant in his dismissal. Now he was the one who looked small and foolish. The other two judges were equally mesmerized. The pop star with the pink hair, a musician who understood the technical difficulty of what she was hearing, had a look of pure, unadulterated respect on her face. She was no longer seeing an old woman. She was seeing a master artist at work, a performer with a level of control and emotional depth that few in the industry could ever hope to achieve. The producer judge, the quiet businessman, had a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a man who had just stumbled upon a treasure. He wasn't just hearing a song. He was hearing a story, a headline, a viral sensation waiting to happen. He saw the interviews, the headlines, the millions of clicks. He saw the raw, authentic human drama that money couldn't buy. But Eleanor wasn't performing for them. She was lost in the music, her body moving with a controlled power that was mesmerizing to watch. It wasn't the choreographed dance of a young pop star. Her movements were simpler, more primal. A fist clenched and raised to the sky during a particularly powerful scream. A slow, deliberate headbang that kept time with the thundering drums. Her free hand would gesture to the lyrics as if shaping the very air with her emotions. She was a conduit, channeling decades of unspoken feelings into a performance that was both deeply personal and universally understood. The song built to its final, devastating crescendo. The guitars screamed, the drums hammered, and Eleanor's voice soared, a perfect blend of the guttural roar and the clean, sorrowful melody. It was a sound of catharsis, a final, triumphant cry of a woman who was no longer silent. The lyrics, though hard to decipher through the power of her delivery, spoke of shadows giving way to light, of a voice finally being heard. It was the anthem of her life, and she was singing it for the whole world to hear. The audience was completely under her spell. The sea of phone lights was no longer a casual distraction. It was a constellation of witnesses, all recording a moment they knew they would never forget. No one was talking, no one was checking their messages. They were just watching, listening, feeling. The young people in the crowd, who had likely dismissed her as a joke, were now staring with their mouths open, their perceptions of age, music, and talent being completely rewritten. They were witnessing a seismic shift, a tectonic plate of prejudice cracking wide open. As the final, soaring note hung in the air, a single, pure sound that seemed to defy gravity, Eleanor held it, her body rigid with the effort. Then she brought it to a sudden, silent close. She cut the sound off with a sharp, final gesture, and the entire arena went black and silent for a moment before the stage lights came back up, bathing her in a single, soft spotlight. She stood there, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling. The powerful front woman was gone, and in her place was once again Eleanor Vance, a 72-year-old woman in a beige cardigan, looking a little tired and a little lost. The arena was still for 2 long heartbeats. It was a sacred silence, a moment where the full weight of what they had just experienced could settle upon them. They had not just been entertained. They had been changed. And then the silence broke. The silence that followed the final hanging note was sacred. It was a heavy, shared breath, a moment where the thousands of people in the arena and the millions watching at home were all processing the impossible thing they had just witnessed. The stage lights seemed to dim for a second, bathing Eleanor in a soft, gentle glow. She stood there, her chest heaving, her body trembling with the exertion and the sudden, crashing wave of vulnerability. The powerful front woman who had commanded the stage just moments before had retreated back inside her, leaving behind a 72-year-old woman who looked tired, small, and suddenly very alone. She blinked, her eyes adjusting, and the world came rushing back in. And then the silence broke. It wasn't a gradual build. It was an explosion. A single person in the front row stood up and started clapping, a loud, sharp sound that broke the spell. It was followed by another, and then another, until a deafening, thunderous roar erupted from the entire arena. It wasn't just applause. It was a physical force, a tidal wave of sound that crashed over the stage and shook the very foundations of the building. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated awe. Every single person was on their feet, a sea of bodies stretching back as far as the eye could see. The lights from their phones, once a constellation of casual observers, were now a blinding galaxy, all pointed at her, capturing a moment that no one would ever believe unless they saw it with their own eyes. Eleanor flinched at the sound, her hands flying up to her ears as if to shield herself from the sheer volume of it. This was not the polite, pitying applause from before. This was something else entirely. It was raw, it was powerful, and it was all for her. A look of pure panic flashed across her face. She was a librarian, a woman who found comfort in the quiet rustle of pages. This wall of noise was overwhelming, terrifying. She took a small step back, her eyes wide, searching for an escape. She looked down and saw her worn leather handbag lying on the floor where she had dropped it. It was her anchor to the real world, a piece of the quiet life she knew. She bent down slowly, her knees aching, and picked it up, clutching it to her chest like a shield. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the confusion and fear in her eyes. This was the human heart of the story. The warrior who had just won the battle was now just a woman, lost in the victory celebration. On the judges' table, the scene was one of utter chaos. Simon, the man who had dismissed her in seconds, was on his feet, his face a mask of disbelief. His carefully constructed persona of the cynical critic had crumbled into dust. He was clapping hard, his hands red, a look of sheer, unadulterated wonder on his face. He kept shaking his head as if trying to clear his vision, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The pop star judge was wiping away a tear, her professional composure completely gone. She was clapping and cheering, a huge, genuine smile on her face. The producer judge was already on his phone, not with a bored expression, but with an urgent, excited energy, talking rapidly into his headset. He wasn't just seeing a performance, he was seeing the future. The host, his smooth script completely forgotten, ran back onto the stage. He looked like a man who had just been through a whirlwind. His hair was messy, his perfect smile replaced by a look of stunned exhilaration. He approached Eleanor slowly, as if she were a wild animal he didn't want to startle. "Eleanor Vance." He shouted into his microphone, his voice barely audible over the roar of the crowd. I don't know what to say. I think I speak for everyone here when I say, we have never seen anything like that in our lives." The crowd roared even louder in agreement. The host gestured for them to quiet down, but it was like trying to calm a storm. He turned to the judge's table, holding his microphone out. The crowd's noise finally subsided to a low, expectant rumble, everyone desperate to hear what the judges would say. The host pointed to Simon. The harsh critic took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. He looked at Eleanor not as a contestant, but as a teacher. "Eleanor," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft, filled with an emotion that no one had ever heard from him before. In 10 years on this show, I have prided myself on being able to spot talent in seconds. I have also prided myself on being honest, sometimes brutally so. And tonight I have never been more wrong in my entire life. A murmur went through the crowd. Simon never admitted he was wrong. I looked at you, he continued, his voice cracking slightly. I saw your age, your cardigan, and I wrote you off. I put you in a box before you even sang a single note. And you didn't just sing, you didn't just perform. You took that box and you smashed it into a million pieces. You took every prejudice, every assumption, and you incinerated it with a voice that comes from a place I can only describe as legendary. You have humbled me, and you have reminded every single one of us to never, ever judge a book by its cover. That was the most shocking, the most powerful, and the most important performance I have ever seen. Thank you. The other two judges chimed in, their words a blur of praise and respect. But it was Simon's apology that hung in the air, the final, crushing blow to the prejudice that had filled the room just minutes before. The host then turned back to Eleanor, who was still standing there, clutching her handbag, looking overwhelmed by it all. Eleanor, he said, his voice now gentle, what do you have to say to all of this? Eleanor looked out at the sea of faces, at the thousands of people who were now looking at her not with pity, but with admiration. She thought of Arthur, of his gentle encouragement, of his belief in the music she kept locked away. A small, sad smile touched her lips. My husband, she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the quiet arena. He always said I had a song in my soul. He was the only one who ever heard it. I just wanted everyone else to hear it too. The simplicity and honesty of her words hit the audience harder than any scream. It was the heart of the story, the quiet love that had given birth to the thunderous roar. The host put his arm around her, a gesture of genuine, protective affection this time. Well, Eleanor, he said, his voice thick with emotion. They heard it. The whole world heard it. He didn't even need to ask for the judges' votes. It was the first and only unanimous standing ovation in the show's history. As Eleanor was led off the stage, her walk was different. It was no longer the slow, nervous shuffle of a woman out of her element. It was slower, yes, but it was steady. It was the walk of someone who had faced a dragon and won. She had walked in as a joke and was leaving as a legend. They had judged her in seconds, a dismissive glance based on age and appearance. But her performance had shattered their prejudice, leaving them and the world forever changed. And as she disappeared into the wings, the roar of the crowd followed her, a promise that the quiet librarian song would be heard for a very, very long time.